And it just dawned on me, I forgot to start this thing recording. And that gets us to the next thing. This is all sort of background stuff before we get to Mark. Why were they written? Only three big reasons. They were written because the original disciples were beginning to die out. The original people who were eyewitnesses to the events of Christ's life were beginning to die out. These were all written, the earliest one, the generation after when Christ was crucified. You've got a span of time that elapses, and certainly one of the big reasons is the eyewitnesses and the people who knew the eyewitnesses are dying out, creating the need to write the material down. And there was a growing realization that Jesus wasn't going to be coming back really soon. He told his followers, I'm coming soon. And they thought soon meant like next week. And yeah, that's right, it's a long week. They thought soon meant next week, and so there wasn't, if Jesus is coming back that imminently, you don't need to write the stuff down to preserve it. But you've got a number of years that have passed now, and it hasn't happened yet. And that's going to create the need. The last one is for evangelistic reasons. The church is spreading. The church is spreading geographically. And as the church spreads geographically, that creates a need for written documents that can be distributed among the churches. You think about, and something I've thought about is this, that as the church spreads, it spreads from a Jewish context to a more Gentile, particularly Greek-Roman context. The Jewish culture remembered everything. Something could be in ancient Jewish culture, a story could be passed down for 500 years and everybody would know it, and it would be unchanged after 500 years. It was a culture that memorized and knew stuff, but the Greco-Roman culture wasn't the same. So as the church spreads beyond its original Jewish context, you have the need for actual written documents. And in some cases you see that apparently these were written and recorded as a hedge, if you will, against heresy, against false doctrines that are beginning to be spread. Hey, the Synoptic Gospels are which ones? Anybody remember what the Synoptic Gospels are? Yeah, which ones are the ones that tell the same stories?
Matthew, Mark.
Yeah, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're called the Synoptic Gospels because even at a very cursory reading, they are very, very similar. Even a very cursory reading of those three Gospels, they are really, really similar. Sure, the story might be recorded a little bit differently in Luke than in Mark, but you can tell clearly it's the same story. And then John is another animal altogether. So you have these three Gospels, which clearly are very, very similar, which leads to a couple of questions. How are they interrelated? What is the relationship between the three? And given that they are really similar, what accounts for their differences? So that is what we need to take a look at. Okay, this is one theory for where you got the Gospels. This isn't gospel. This isn't law and truth, but it is a theory. It is plausible. According to, and what I'm going to tell you is the prevailing theory among New Testament scholars now. Prevailing opinion is that Mark was written first. And Matthew and Luke had access to Mark and relied on Mark as, if you will, as source material. Because when you read all three, you see there's lots and lots of stuff that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have. And there is pretty much no stuff that Mark has that they don't have. So that, when you're looking at it, it appears then that Matthew and Luke have access to Mark, and so we got that. And then you also have this other stuff, a fair amount of other stuff, which Matthew and Luke have, but which Mark doesn't have, which means that there's some other tradition, some other body of material that they have access to that Mark didn't have access to. And when you look at this diagram, you see Mark up there, and an arrow going to Matthew, arrow going to Luke. Okay, we got that. This other body of material, this other source, is generally called Q, and that's a German word, Kel or Kella. I'm not certain how to be pronounced, but it simply means source. And so you have this other body of Jesus material, which Matthew and Luke have, that Mark doesn't have. So you see those arrows. Q may not have ever been a document that was written. It is purely hypothetical. It could be simply nothing more than an oral tradition about Jesus that they had. It could have been a document that was written. If it was written, there's never been a manuscript of it. Like I said, it is entirely hypothetical. And then Matthew and Luke each have a little bit of stuff that is unique to them. So that's where the M and the L come from. So this is called the four-source hypothesis. That's the technical term for it. You have Mark's gospel, and most everything in Mark, nearly everything in Mark is recorded in Matthew and Luke. And then Matthew and Luke have stuff that Mark doesn't have, which means that there's another body of information that they had that Mark didn't have, or that he didn't choose to record. And then you have other stuff, the M and the L, and the information that Matthew relied on and Luke relied on that the other Gospels didn't record. Is that clear as mud? So we've got this background stuff on the Gospels. Let's take a look at Mark itself. And anytime you talk about a biblical book, you need to think about who wrote it and when it was written, what the setting was. Remember, we were talking about something that was written nearly 2,000 years ago. And so you cannot be absolutely metaphysically certain about this, but almost certainly it was written by John Mark, who shows up in Acts. He's also referred to in 1 Peter. Almost certainly is written by John Mark, and you find him sporadically in the book of Acts. He had a pretty famous falling out with Paul because John Mark bailed out on one of Paul's evangelistic journeys, missionary journeys, and Paul got really crossed off with it. And Actually, one of the things, Steve mentioned this, one of the things that people say that makes this tradition sound plausible is that they would never ascribe this book, a gospel, to a pretty minor figure like that. If you're going to ascribe it, if you're going to make up a name, okay, we got this book and it's a gospel, we got to pick somebody to have written it. You're not going to pick John Mark from the book of Acts. Pick another disciple. Pick Andrew. Pick somebody that's actually reasonably important. The date, there's, at the very earliest, you'll see this book dated to even before 50 AD. The latest I've seen is, say, about 75 AD. My personal opinion is, and I think it's a really valid one, is that we're looking at somewhere mid-late 60s. Somewhere mid to late 60s. There is an incredibly strong tradition in the early church, and that is attested by several different early church fathers. Eusebius quoted somebody named Papias who lived like 100 to about 140 or so AD. Eusebius quoted Papias talking about how Mark got his information from Peter. That also shows up in Clement of Alexandria, who lived in the 2nd century, Tertullian, Irenaeus. It is an incredibly strong early church tradition that Mark was an associate of Peter when Peter was in Rome, and that Peter was essentially source material for Mark. And I think that is a really, really strong early church tradition. And when you've got that many different people among the church fathers talking about it, I think that we can put a bet on it. Peter was martyred in Rome in the mid-60s, and one of Nero's fits of rage. The city of Rome burned to the ground in 64 AD, I think. Nero himself probably started the fire, but he had to have somebody to be a scapegoat for it. An insane emperor is not going to admit to everybody, oh, yeah, I accidentally burned the city to the ground. He's got to have somebody to blame. Christians were a nice, convenient scapegoat. And for the last 4 years of his reign, I mean, he made life, and to put it bluntly, hell on earth for the Christian church within Rome. And Peter and Paul were both martyred as part of that. By tradition, Peter was crucified upside down, and that's a famous painting there in the lower right corner by Caravaggio, I think. That's who painted that. But to me, it makes the most sense to place this gospel being written in a Roman context to a Roman church in the years probably right after when Peter died. So somewhere in the mid to late 60s, 64 through maybe 68, somewhere in that window. It is clearly a very Gentile gospel. Mark doesn't seem to have much inner knowledge of Jewish customs and festivities. Other gospel writers show a lot more knowledge of the Old Testament than Mark does. So it is clearly something written for a Gentile audience. So this is not something that has been written to a church in Rome or Palestine. It's written to a church that is predominantly Gentile. So the best bet is that you're looking at mid to late 60s to the church in Rome, a church which is under intense pressure. There are Christians who are being burned alive like Nero's gardens. This is bad stuff. And as you go through the gospel, if you're really attentive, you can see things, and I'll point them out, that would really strike home to a church which is under that sort of pressure. Just a little bit about Mark's composition. Some books in the New Testament, if we all sit down to write, some of us are going to write better than others. Somebody who's got a PhD in English literature is going to write differently than somebody who is a 10th grade dropout. And so if you look at the New Testament, Luke and Acts are written in really, really fine Greek. Hebrews is. First Peter is. Revelation is written like me, and so and so and so and so seen something. I mean, we seen it, not we saw it. It's me and so seen it. I mean, it's terrible grammar. Mark isn't so much terrible grammar, but it's very simple. It's very simple and crude. You read a third grader's or fourth grader's writing, we did this, and we did that, and we did that, and we did that. That's the way Mark is written. This isn't polished Greek at all. That's what I was getting at when I said they're each writing about the same Jesus material, about Jesus, but they're leaving their own fingerprints on it. Yeah.
Mark couldn't have been much more than 18, 21 whenever he was linked up to Paul, could he? And Jesus, when just only died. I'm trying to get that relationship and see if he would not be the one. After some years had passed, he was one of he was so young at the time he experienced what he did with Paul.
Yeah, if you figure John Mark's interaction with Paul, if you figure that's 50, just to pick a number. And by the time he wrote this, if my hunch is correct, then he would be probably 15 years older. But we don't know how old he would have been when he was a companion of Paul. And so,
since he was the nephew of I felt like he was just a very young.
Yeah, he may have been, which would explain why he decided to bail out in one of the missionary journeys.
He didn't like that open.
That's right. That's right. Now before I go one thing, we have these Gospels and they're recorded in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Why in the world in that order? And there was one tradition that goes back to St. Augustine, which says that Matthew was written first, and that Mark was a very crude and clumsy. Mark made a pretty crude and clumsy gospel as an addition to Matthew. That he was a crude, clumsy copy of Matthew. That goes back to St. Augustine. In reality, Matthew was listed first because it was the gospel that's used the most. In the first couple of centuries, Matthew was the one that this is the one that they used the most, that they loved the most, they read the most. Far and away. Hence the reason why it's listed first. It is not listed first because it was written first. It is listed first because it, far and away, is what the early church loved the most, what they used the most. After that, the other three appear to be probably in chronological order. But Matthew is listed first because it was first in their hearts. Okay, now I want to take a few minutes and talk about some of the things that are really unique about Mark. They've got the Roadrunner, the Three Stooges, and somebody trying to keep a secret. When you read the Gospels, how often have you read the Gospels? You know, so-and-so that happened, and Jesus told his disciples, don't tell anyone. Be sure that you don't tell anyone. Have you come across that in the Gospels? You find it in all three of the Synoptic Gospels. I don't know that it's there in John, but you find it in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, and it's, why in the world is that? Why in the world did Jesus tell his followers, don't tell anybody? Well, you find this most in the Gospel of Mark. All the time in the Gospel of Mark, you find Jesus telling his disciples, don't tell anybody. He heals somebody, and then immediately, don't tell anybody. Casts out a demon, and right after that, don't tell anybody. And this is called the Messianic secret. That's there's been a ton of stuff written trying to explain this, and we'll come across it a lot. I'm not going to go into it now, but that is a huge feature in Mark. Over and over again, something happens, particularly in the first half of the gospel, and Jesus says, don't tell anybody. Mark's portrait of the disciples is really dim. Hence the picture of the Three Stooges. You read through the Gospel of Mark, and they come off as start naming bad adjectives. Name bad adjectives for me. Stupid. Yes, there's a good one for the disciples in Mark. What else would you say? Illiterate. Yeah, they probably were that too.
Bumbling.
What?
Bumbling.
Bumbling, yeah. Mm-hmm. And unfaithful. Over and over and over again, and in this gospel, Jesus, it's like he's looking at the disciples and, how long have I got to put up with you? You don't get it? Over and over again, the disciples show a lack of understanding, a lack of faith. Which is really curious. It's something else that really points to how genuine this would be, because if it is something that is made up, the disciples would never have made this stuff up, because they sure don't come off looking good. And I'd encourage you to read this gospel. You can read it in one sitting. Just sit down and read all the way through it between now and next Wednesday. And as you do, look for who actually understands who Jesus is. You have the crowds who are tagging along because they like to see a good show. And they're going to tag along because he heals people, he casts out demons, he does his big fancy stuff, and they tag along to see that. They don't have any idea who Jesus is and don't really care. He puts on a good show for them. The disciples are at least following him, but they don't understand. They don't have a whole heck of a lot of faith. The only people in this gospel, the only beings in this gospel who truly know who Jesus are the demons. Read it. His opponents, principally the demons that he casts out, they know who he is. But his own followers don't get it. And at the end of the book, at the end of the gospel, and Jesus dies alone, there's nobody there. In John, you have this really touching picture of the the beloved disciple, probably John, there with Jesus' mother, and it is a really beautiful picture there. And in Mark, he's abandoned. Jesus is abandoned. And you get a portrait of Jesus, it's a tragic portrait. It's Shakespearean. It's a tragic portrait. Somebody who is misunderstood. Only people who truly know who he is are the ones who hate him. His opponents. And he comes off as a really tragic figure. This is, like I mentioned, we're by far the shortest of the Gospels. By far the shortest of the Gospels. It starts, turn to Mark 1. Here's how it begins. At the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, Prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his path straight. John appeared, baptized in the wilderness, and proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. That's the beginning. There's no birth narrative. Zero birth narrative. Zero about his early life. If you read the first chapter, the first chapter gets the gospel, the ministry of John the Baptist, the baptism of Jesus, the beginning of Jesus' ministry, the call of the disciples, healing somebody with an unclean spirit, healing a whole multitude of people, preaching in Galilee, and healing a leper. All in one chapter. It is the shortest of the Gospels. When you read through the Gospel of Mark, one of the things I'd encourage you to look for is how urgent everything seems to be. There's a Greek word that is translated immediately, euthus. It's used 42 times. 42 times in the Gospel of Mark. So as you read through it, and immediately something happened, and immediately such and such else happened, and immediately such and such else happened. If you're reading, if you've got a more literal English translation, like New American Standard, English Standard, King James, you're going to really get that. Now, they're going to, pretty much every time it's going to be translated, that euthus will be translated immediately, and you're going to see that word so much, it's going to seem like, that's bad writing. You don't get it as much, in, say, the NRSV. You don't get it hardly at all in the NIV. Because the editors of the NIV, when they wrote it, this is bad writing. We've got to change this up. So in some place they use immediately, other place they might use it once or something else. But you miss the point. It's immediately over and over and over and over again, 42 times. And immediately something happened. They have this sense of really rushed pace. Two-thirds of the sentences in Mark begin with "and." So this is like third grade, fourth grade. You read a third grader's writing. And we did this, and we did that, and we did that. That's sort of the picture you get here. When two-thirds of the sentences begin with "and." We don't do that. I bet Luke didn't do it. But there's a real sense of immediacy here, of urgency as you read the gospel. There's seem to be a whole lot of connection between the individual stories that are told. He tells a story and immediately tells another story and immediately he tells another one. So it is really hard, as you read this, to get an idea for chronology. Are two events, are they separated by a week or by 6 months? For the most part, it is impossible to tell. It is impossible to tell. But the biggest thing to this is simply how fast things happen. Mark doesn't tell nearly as many stories. Mark doesn't have nearly as, the gospel is shorter than the others. And Matthew and Luke have a lot of other stuff that Mark doesn't have, but curiously, when Mark describes something that is common to all three, his descriptions tend to be longer. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell these same 25 accounts of a miracle or a teaching or whatever, just to pick a number. Mark's descriptions are going to be longer most of the time. He just doesn't tell nearly as much. Well, like I said, St. Augustine regarded Mark as being a pretty clumsy abridgment, a pretty clumsy, Reader's Digest condensed version of Matthew. I would, St. Augustine a lot smarter than me, but I would take issue with him. And actually, for most of church history, Mark has been the least studied of the four Gospels up until, say, the last 150 years. And in the last 150 years, this Gospel has finally gotten some view. So there's a lot of work being done on it now after a lot of neglect. But I think that what you'll find if you read this is that there's a lot of power in this. That there's incredible power simply from the simplicity and how fast things take place. It's not power that comes in the poetry of the language or how artistic it is. Power from simply how fast it is. And this happened, and he did this, and he did this, and he did the other. All the while, misunderstood by his closest friends, with a large crowd of attackers along who couldn't have cared less. And ultimately, as I said, dying totally alone. You all have any questions? What I'd like for it to do is, between now and next Wednesday, just take the gospel and read all the way through it. You can read all the way through it, and it won't take that much time. There's only like 16 chapters, and it'll be a short read and a very pleasant read. Again, any other questions? I've enjoyed it. I'll see you next week.